July 1944. The sun beats down on the shattered cliffs of Saipan. Smoke drifts across the battered landscape, mingling with the cries of wounded men and the distant rumble of artillery. In a narrow ravine, a group of Japanese mothers huddle with their children, pressed against the cool earth, hearts pounding with fear. For days, they have hidden in darkness, surviving on scraps, haunted by the stories of what the Americans would do if they were found. Suddenly, the sound of boots on gravel. U.S. Marines, weapons lowered, approach with cautious steps. One Marine kneels, gently setting his rifle aside. He pulls a towel from his pack and drapes it over the shoulders of a trembling mother, shielding her from the harsh sun and the gaze of the world. Another Marine opens a ration tin, offering food to a hungry child whose eyes are wide with confusion and hope. The mothers break down, tears streaming down their faces. Relief, disbelief, and exhaustion overwhelm them. In that moment, the war's brutality gives way to something unexpected. A fragile act of mercy, a bridge between enemies, and the first taste of safety these families have known in months. The Pacific War was a crucible of fear, propaganda, and unimaginable hardship for civilians. By the summer of 1944, the U.S. island-hopping campaign had reached the Marianas, and Saipan became the next target in the relentless push toward Japan. For the Japanese government and military, Saipan was not just a strategic outpost. It was a symbol of the empire's reach and a final barrier before the home islands themselves. For years, the Japanese population, both in the homeland and in the colonies, had been steeped in a culture of total war. Propaganda was everywhere. Posters, radio broadcasts, and school lessons warned that the Americans were brutal, merciless, and would show no pity to those who surrendered. Mothers were told to protect their children at all costs, even if it meant death. The government distributed grenades and cyanide to civilians, instructing them to use these rather than fall into enemy hands. The message was clear: surrender was not an option. On Saipan, the civilian population was a complex tapestry. Japanese settlers, Okinawans, Koreans, and native Chamorro people lived side by side, many brought to the island to support the war effort. As the American invasion began on June 15, 1944, the island's 25,000 civilians were swept up in the chaos. The Japanese military, determined to resist to the last, often forced civilians to accompany them, using them as laborers, messengers, and, in the most desperate moments, human shields. The battle itself was a nightmare. For 3 weeks, U.S. Marines and Army soldiers fought yard by yard against entrenched Japanese defenders. Artillery and naval gunfire turned villages and sugarcane fields into moonscapes. The Japanese garrison, outnumbered and outgunned, fought with a ferocity that stunned even the battle-hardened Americans. As the lines collapsed, the civilian population was caught in the crossfire. Families were separated, food and water ran out, and the air was thick with rumors, some true, many exaggerated, of what would happen if the Americans won. In this climate of terror, thousands of civilians fled into the island's caves, ravines, and dense jungle. Mothers clutched their children, hiding in darkness, surviving on scraps, and listening to the distant sounds of battle. Some carried poison or grenades, prepared to end their lives and those of their children rather than face capture. Others simply waited, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty. The Japanese military's own actions often deepened the sense of dread. Soldiers sometimes threatened or coerced civilians, warning them that the Americans would torture or kill anyone who surrendered. In some cases, officers distributed grenades to mothers, instructing them to use them on themselves and their children if the enemy approached. The psychological pressure was immense, and the stories of mass suicides at places like Marpi Point and the cliffs of Saipan became some of the most haunting images of the Pacific War. Yet, even in the midst of this terror, there were moments of hope. Some civilians, desperate and starving, risked everything to approach American lines. The first encounters were tense, shaped by mutual suspicion and the ever-present threat of violence. But as the Marines lowered their weapons and offered food, water, and shelter, a new narrative began to emerge, one that challenged the propaganda of both sides and revealed the shared humanity beneath the uniforms and the fear. The story of Japanese mothers breaking down as U.S. Marines shielded them with towels and fed their children is not just a tale of compassion in the midst of war. It is a window into the psychological and cultural forces that shaped the Pacific conflict, and a testament to the power of small acts of mercy to change the course of lives and history itself. The American military, advancing across the Pacific, faced a dilemma that was both logistical and moral. The Geneva Convention required humane treatment of civilians, but the realities of combat on islands like Saipan and Okinawa were far more complex. U.S. commanders knew that every cave, every ravine could conceal not only enemy soldiers, but also terrified families, mothers, children, and the elderly, driven underground by months of bombardment and years of fear. The U.S. Marine Corps and Army units were briefed on the likelihood of encountering civilians. Leaflets were dropped in Japanese, urging non-combatants to surrender and promising safety. Loudspeakers blared messages across the battlefield, sometimes voiced by Japanese-American interpreters, pleading with families to come out of hiding. Yet, the power of wartime propaganda was not easily undone. Many civilians, conditioned to expect brutality, hesitated until starvation or desperation forced them to act. When Japanese civilians did emerge, the first moments were fraught with tension. Marines, trained for combat, had to quickly shift to a posture of restraint and compassion. Weapons were lowered. Medics and chaplains were called forward. The first gestures were simple but profound: a canteen of water, a blanket, a gentle word. For mothers and children, these acts were almost incomprehensible. The towels draped over their shoulders, the food pressed into their hands, were not just comforts, they were a lifeline, a signal that the nightmare might finally be ending. Behind these moments of mercy was a vast logistical effort. The U.S. military established refugee collection points, field hospitals, and makeshift kitchens. Marines and Army personnel worked alongside Navy corpsmen and Red Cross volunteers to provide food, water, and medical care. Children suffering from malnutrition were given milk and vitamins. Mothers, many of whom had not slept or eaten properly in days, were offered shelter and reassurance. The challenge was immense. Thousands of civilians, traumatized and suspicious, needed to be fed, clothed, and protected in the midst of an active battlefield. The compassion shown by American troops was not universal, nor was it always easy. There were moments of confusion, language barriers, and the ever-present risk that a civilian might be hiding a weapon or acting under duress. Yet, the overall record, documented in after-action reports, photographs, and the memories of survivors, was one of remarkable restraint and humanity. For many Marines, the sight of mothers weeping with relief as their children were fed and comforted became one of the most enduring memories of the campaign. The Japanese government, meanwhile, struggled to control the narrative. News of American kindness was suppressed or dismissed as propaganda. Survivors who returned to Japan after the war often found it difficult to speak of their experiences, fearing disbelief or accusations of disloyalty. Yet, the stories persisted, passed down in families, recorded in memoirs, and, in time, acknowledged as part of the complex legacy of the Pacific War. The encounter between Japanese mothers and U.S. Marines on Saipan was not an isolated event. Similar scenes played out on Tinian, Guam, and, most tragically, Okinawa. Each time the pattern was the same: fear and suspicion giving way, slowly and painfully, to relief and gratitude. The towels, the food, the gentle hands, these became symbols of a different kind of victory. one measured not in territory gained, but in lives saved and trust restored. As the war ground on and the front lines moved ever closer to Japan, the lessons of Saipan would shape American policy and practice. The experience of caring for enemy civilians in the midst of battle became a model for future operations, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, compassion could break through the barriers of hatred and fear. For the Japanese mothers and children on Saipan, the journey from terror to relief was a passage through the deepest shadows of war. In the caves and ravines, mothers clung to their children, whispering reassurances they barely believed themselves. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, and the constant thunder of battle frayed their nerves. Every sound outside, a distant explosion, a shouted command, could mean discovery. Or worse, the moment of surrender was a collision of fear and hope. Emerging from darkness, the mothers shielded their children's eyes from the harsh sunlight and the unfamiliar faces of American Marines. Some children cried, others stared in silence, too weak or frightened to react. The mothers, exhausted and desperate, braced for violence. Instead, they were met with towels, food, and gentle words. The shock was overwhelming. Tears flowed freely, not just from relief, but from the release of months of terror and uncertainty. For many, the first taste of American rations, a piece of bread, a sip of milk, was almost surreal. Children who had not smiled in weeks began to eat, their mothers watching in disbelief. The Marines, some barely older than the children they helped, offered what comfort they could. They wrapped towels around shivering shoulders, carried the weakest to safety, and tried, in halting Japanese or with simple gestures, to reassure the families that they were safe. The decision to protect and care for Japanese civilians was not just a matter of compassion. It was a tactical necessity. The U.S. military understood that the presence of civilians on the battlefield complicated every operation. Civilians could be used as human shields, or their suffering could be exploited for propaganda. More importantly, the mass suicides and civilian casualties on Saipan shocked American commanders and the public back home. In response, U.S. forces developed new protocols. Leaflets and loudspeakers urged civilians to surrender. Special teams, including Japanese-American interpreters, were assigned to coax families from hiding. Refugee collection points were established behind the lines, where civilians could be processed, fed, and given medical care. The goal was clear: minimize civilian casualties, undermine Japanese propaganda, and demonstrate American values in action. These efforts were not without risk. Marines and soldiers entering caves or ravines could not always be sure who or what they would find. There were tragic incidents, moments of confusion and fear. But the overall approach was one of restraint and humanity, shaped by the lessons of earlier battles and the desire to avoid further tragedy. Caring for thousands of civilians in a combat zone required a logistical effort as complex as any military operation. The U.S. military mobilized resources on an unprecedented scale. Field kitchens were set up to provide hot meals. Medical tents treated wounds, malnutrition, and disease. Blankets, towels, and clothing were distributed, often improvised from whatever supplies could be spared. The Red Cross and Navy corpsmen played a crucial role, working alongside Marines and Army personnel to care for the most vulnerable. Children suffering from dehydration or illness were given priority. Mothers, many of whom had lost everything, were offered shelter and a chance to rest. The challenge was immense. Food and water had to be brought in by truck or landing craft, and every new group of refugees stretched resources to the limit. Yet, the effort was sustained. Reports from the time described the care taken to ensure that no one went hungry, that every child received attention, and that families were kept together whenever possible. The towels that Marines draped over mothers' shoulders, the rations pressed into children's hands, these were not just acts of kindness, but the visible signs of a vast, coordinated response to human suffering. The compassion shown by U.S. Marines on Saipan was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate decisions made by commanders at every level. American officers, confronted with the reality of mass civilian suffering, quickly recognized that the war in the Pacific was not just a military campaign, it was a battle for hearts and minds. Orders were issued to treat civilians with respect, to provide food and medical care, and to avoid unnecessary violence. Commanders like General Holland Smith and Admiral Raymond Spruance understood that the eyes of the world were watching, and that every act of mercy could have far-reaching consequences. Japanese officers, on the other hand, faced a crisis of authority. Many had been ordered to prevent surrender at all costs, and some went so far as to threaten or coerce civilians into suicide rather than capture. When it became clear that the Americans were not the monsters described in propaganda, some Japanese officers surrendered alongside their men and families, while others took their own lives. The presence of Japanese-American interpreters, Nisei soldiers, was crucial. These men, fluent in both languages and cultures, helped bridge the gap of fear and misunderstanding, persuading civilians to trust the Marines and accept help. For Japanese civilians, especially mothers, surrender was fraught with shame and fear. The Bushido Code, which glorified death over defeat, had been drilled into the population for years. Mothers were told that their duty was to protect their children from dishonor, even if it meant death. The idea of accepting help from the enemy was almost unthinkable. Yet, the reality of American compassion shattered these expectations. The sight of Marines shielding women with towels, feeding hungry children, and offering gentle words was a profound shock. Some mothers wept openly, overcome by relief and the collapse of months of terror. Others struggled to reconcile their gratitude with the guilt of survival. The experience forced many to question the stories they had been told, and to see their former enemies in a new light. The acts of mercy on Saipan were not without their moral complexities. For American troops, the challenge was to balance compassion with caution. There were real risks. Civilians could be hiding weapons or acting under duress from Japanese soldiers. Every act of kindness required a leap of faith, a willingness to trust in the basic humanity of the other side. For the U.S. government and military, the humanitarian treatment of Japanese civilians became a powerful tool in the battle for public opinion. Photographs of Marines feeding children and comforting mothers were published in newspapers and magazines, countering Japanese propaganda and bolstering support for the war effort. The stories of compassion on Saipan and other islands became part of the larger narrative of American values, proof that even in the midst of brutal conflict, mercy could prevail. Yet the moral questions lingered. Was compassion a strategy or a genuine response to suffering? Could acts of mercy erase the horrors of war, or were they simply moments of light in a landscape of darkness? For the mothers and children who survived, the answer was both simple and profound. In the moment of greatest need, a towel, a meal, and a gentle hand were enough to restore hope. July 1944. The battle for Saipan is reaching its final desperate days. The American advance has pushed the last Japanese defenders and thousands of civilians into the island's northern cliffs and ravines. The air is thick with smoke and the distant thunder of naval guns. In the chaos, a group of Japanese mothers and children, gaunt from hunger and exhaustion, crouch in the shadows of a limestone cave. Their faces are streaked with dirt and tears. For days, they have survived on rainwater and scraps, listening to the sounds of battle and the whispered warnings of soldiers who told them to fear the Americans above all else. Outside, U.S. Marines move cautiously through the shattered landscape. They know the caves may hold desperate soldiers, but they also know that civilians are trapped inside. The order is clear: proceed with care, offer surrender, and protect non-combatants. A Nisei interpreter calls out in Japanese, his voice echoing through the rocks, promising safety and food. There is a long, tense silence. Then, slowly, a mother emerges, clutching her child to her chest. Others follow, blinking in the harsh sunlight, trembling with fear and uncertainty. The Marines lower their weapons. One steps forward, removing his helmet, and kneeling to meet the frightened eyes of a little girl. He offers her a canteen of water, then gently drapes a towel over her mother's shoulders. Another Marine opens a ration tin, breaking off pieces of bread and handing them to the children. The mothers, overwhelmed by relief and disbelief, begin to sob. Some collapse to their knees, clutching their children, unable to contain the flood of emotion that has been held back for so long. The moment is transformative. The Marines, many of them barely older than the children they are helping, are moved by the raw humanity before them. Some wipe away their own tears as they work, passing out towels, food, and blankets. The Nisei interpreter reassures the mothers, explaining that they are safe, that the war is over for them. The fear that has defined every moment of their lives for months begins to ebb, replaced by a fragile sense of hope. Word spreads quickly through the camp. More families emerge from hiding, drawn by the stories of kindness and the promise of safety. The Marines set up a makeshift aid station where medics treat wounds and distribute food. Children who have not spoken in days begin to laugh and play. Mothers, still wary, watch as their children eat and drink, their faces softening with each passing hour. For the Japanese mothers, the breakdown is not just a release of fear, it is a reckoning with everything they have been taught. The enemy is not a monster, but a young man with a gentle voice and a steady hand. The towel on their shoulders, the food in their children's hands are more than comforts. They are symbols of a world turned upside down, of a future that might yet hold peace. For the Marines, the experience is equally profound. The brutality of battle is momentarily forgotten, replaced by the simple act of caring for another human being. The memory of these moments will stay with them long after the war is over. A reminder that even in the darkest times, compassion can break through the barriers of hatred and fear. The decisive moment has come. The cycle of terror is broken, if only for a day. In the ravines of Saipan, the war's brutality gives way to mercy, and the first fragile seeds of reconciliation are sown. In the days that followed the first encounters, the transformation within the makeshift refugee camps on Saipan was unmistakable. The initial shock and disbelief that greeted the Marines' acts of mercy slowly gave way to a fragile sense of trust. Each morning, more families emerged from the caves and ravines, drawn by the stories of towels, food, and gentle hands. The Marines, now practiced in the delicate work of reassurance, greeted each new arrival with patience and care. The logistics of compassion became a daily operation. Field kitchens worked around the clock, preparing rice, bread, and soup for hundreds of hungry mouths. Navy corpsmen and Red Cross volunteers moved from tent to tent, treating wounds and checking on the weakest children. Marines, many of whom had never before seen the face of the enemy up close, found themselves carrying toddlers, comforting mothers, and improvising games to coax smiles from traumatized children. The language barrier was ever present, but gestures and kindness bridged the gap. Nisei interpreters became indispensable, translating not just words but intentions, explaining to mothers that they would not be separated from their children, that they would be safe, that the war was over for them. Some mothers, still haunted by fear, hesitated to accept food or water, but the persistence of the Marines wore down their resistance. Each meal, each towel, each gentle word chipped away at the wall of suspicion built by years of propaganda. The emotional impact was profound. For the mothers, the breakdown was not a single moment, but a process, a slow unraveling of fear, replaced by gratitude and, eventually, relief. Some wept openly as they watched their children eat, the memory of hunger and terror still fresh. Others sat in silence, holding their children close, unable to find words for the mix of emotions that flooded them. The Marines, too, were changed. Hardened by battle, they found themselves moved by the vulnerability and resilience of the families in their care. Stories of these encounters spread quickly, both within the camp and beyond. War correspondents and military photographers captured images of Marines feeding children, draping towels over mothers, and playing with the youngest refugees. These photographs, published in newspapers and magazines back home, became symbols of a different kind of victory, one measured not in territory gained, but in lives saved and trust restored. The Japanese survivors, for their part, began to share their own stories. In whispered conversations and, later, in letters and memoirs, they described the moment when fear gave way to hope. Some spoke of the shame they felt at having believed the worst about the Americans. Others recalled the kindness of a particular Marine, the way he smiled, the way he knelt to offer food, the way he shielded a mother from the sun with his own towel. These memories became touchstones, reminders that even in the midst of war, humanity could prevail. The transformation was not without its challenges. Not all encounters were free of tension or misunderstanding. There were moments of confusion, of language failing, of old fears resurfacing. But the overall pattern was clear. The acts of mercy on Saipan set a precedent for the treatment of civilians in later battles, including the even more devastating campaign on Okinawa. For the U.S. military, the experience shaped policy and practice. Commanders recognized the value of compassion, not just as a moral imperative, but as a strategic asset. The care shown to Japanese civilians undermined enemy propaganda, encouraged surrender, and helped lay the groundwork for post-war reconciliation. The Marines who had shielded mothers with towels and fed their children carried those memories with them, a quiet counterpoint to the violence and loss that defined so much of the Pacific War. As the last families were processed and the camps began to empty, the legacy of those days lingered. The mothers and children who had once hidden in fear now looked to the future with cautious hope. The Marines, preparing for the next battle, carried with them the knowledge that even in the darkest moments, a simple act of kindness could change the course of a life, and, perhaps, the course of history. The end of the battle for Saipan marked a turning point not only in the Pacific War, but in the lives of the Japanese civilians who survived it. As the guns fell silent and the island was declared secure, the makeshift refugee camps became centers of recovery and transition. For many mothers and children, the trauma of hiding, hunger, and loss was still fresh. But the daily routines of camp life, meals, medical checks, and the presence of American guards who now acted as protectors brought a fragile sense of stability. Repatriation was a slow and uncertain process. The U.S. military, working with the Red Cross and local authorities, began to organize the return of civilians to their homes, or, for many, to temporary settlements elsewhere in the Marianas, or even to mainland Japan. Each family was registered, given new clothing, and provided with basic supplies. The process was marked by a mix of relief and anxiety. Some mothers worried about relatives still missing, others about the future in a homeland they had not seen in years. Stories of American compassion spread quickly among the survivors. Mothers spoke of the Marines who had shielded them from the sun, the corpsmen who had treated their children's wounds, and the cooks who had made sure no one went hungry. These stories, passed from family to family, became a quiet counter-narrative to the fear and suspicion that had dominated the final days of the battle. For many, the memory of that first meal, that first towel, remained a symbol of hope in a world still marked by uncertainty. The U.S. military and the Red Cross documented these efforts in reports and photographs. After-action summaries noted the remarkable cooperation of Japanese civilians once their basic needs were met. Medical officers recorded the rapid improvement in health among children and mothers who had been on the brink of starvation. Letters from Marines and Navy personnel described the emotional impact of caring for former enemies, and some of these accounts found their way into newspapers and magazines back home. The Japanese government, struggling to maintain morale and control the flow of information, was slow to acknowledge the reality of American humanitarian actions. Official statements downplayed the stories of compassion, but returning civilians quietly shared their experiences with friends and neighbors. Over time, these personal testimonies began to challenge the wartime narrative of the enemy as a merciless monster. For the mothers and children who survived Saipan, the aftermath was a time of rebuilding, of bodies, of families, and of trust. The memory of American towels and food, of gentle hands and kind words, became part of their story. A reminder that even in the darkest moments, mercy could prevail. In the years that followed, the memories of Saipan's refugee camps lingered quietly in the lives of those who had survived. For many Japanese mothers, the experience of being shielded and fed by U.S. Marines became a private touchstone, a moment when the world's cruelty was interrupted by an unexpected act of mercy. Some spoke of it only in hushed tones to their children or grandchildren, while others kept the memory locked away, too complex and emotional to revisit. The silence was not just personal. In post-war Japan, the trauma of defeat and occupation made stories of American compassion difficult to share openly. The official narrative, shaped by years of propaganda and the need to rebuild national pride, left little room for tales of kindness from the former enemy. Yet, in family circles and among survivors, the stories persisted. They were told in the details: the taste of the first real meal after weeks of hunger, the feel of a towel on sunburned skin, the gentle voice of a Marine who spoke a few words of Japanese. For the U.S. military, the legacy of Saipan's humanitarian efforts influenced future operations. The lessons learned in the Marianas shaped the approach to civilian care on Okinawa, and, later, in the occupation of Japan itself. Reports from the Red Cross and military medical officers were studied and circulated, emphasizing the importance of compassion, organization, and cultural sensitivity in dealing with enemy populations. The photographs and letters that captured these moments became part of the broader American narrative of the war, evidence that mercy could coexist with victory. The impact of these encounters also rippled into the evolving relationship between the United States and Japan. In the decades after the war, as the two nations moved from enemies to allies, the quiet testimonies of mothers and Marines became part of the foundation for reconciliation. Japanese survivors who later visited Saipan or corresponded with former American soldiers often cited those moments of kindness as the first seeds of trust in a new era. Historians and journalists, piecing together the stories from both sides, have come to see the events on Saipan as emblematic of the war's complexity. The same battle that witnessed unimaginable violence also gave rise to moments of profound humanity. The towels, the food, the gentle hands, these became symbols not just of survival, but of the possibility of healing after even the deepest wounds. As the survivors aged and their children grew up in a world shaped by peace, the memory of those days on Saipan remained a quiet testament to the enduring power of compassion, and a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, mercy can change the course of lives and nations. History often records the violence and destruction of war in numbers and headlines. Yet, it is in the quiet, human moments, when fear gives way to mercy, and enemies become caretakers, that the true meaning of conflict and reconciliation is revealed. The story of Japanese mothers breaking down as U.S. Marines shielded them with towels and fed their children on Saipan is one such moment. It is a story not of victory or defeat, but of the fragile, persistent hope that endures even in the midst of devastation. For the mothers and children who emerged from the darkness of caves and ravines, the war's end was not marked by parades or proclamations, but by the simple acts of kindness that restored their faith in humanity. A towel draped over a trembling shoulder, a meal shared with a hungry child, these gestures became lifelines, reminders that compassion can survive even the most brutal circumstances. For the Marines, the experience left an indelible mark. The memory of comforting former enemies, of seeing fear dissolve into relief, became a quiet counterpoint to the violence and loss that defined so much of the Pacific Campaign. In those moments, the boundaries between us and them blurred, replaced by a recognition of shared vulnerability and the universal need for mercy. The legacy of Saipan's acts of compassion endures in the stories passed down through families, in the photographs and letters preserved in archives, and in the evolving relationship between Japan and the United States. It is a legacy that challenges us to look beyond the rhetoric of war and to remember the power of small mercies to heal even the deepest wounds. In the end, the story of towels and food on Saipan is a reminder that history is shaped not only by the battles we fight, but by the humanity we choose to show. Even in the darkest hours, a single act of kindness can light the way toward peace.